Hello students! Today we are going to be looking at another assignment coming from the Stanford History Education Group, and this is focusing on the Stamp Act, another critical piece in our understanding of the series of dominoes that are falling over leading up to the American Revolution. As we think of the American Revolution, it's important to recognize it's not like a light switch. This doesn't just happen overnight. In fact, there's a really gradual thing where we have a series of events that are contributing to the tension and the complaints that the colonists are stating towards the King of England, King George. So a few things to keep in mind even before we look at what's going on in the context with the Stamp Acts is thinking of some of the things that had already occurred leading up to this point. And as we look at the Stamp Act, we're going to be looking at 1765. November is when the Stamp Act is actually going to take effect. So prior to this, what we have in the colonies in the late 1750s is the French and Indian War. And although the name might be confusing, whereas you might think the French are fighting against the Indians, it's actually the British, the colonies that are fighting against the French, and the French had control of areas that were near the colonies. And there is a series of conflicts between the French, who are allied with the Indians, and the colonies and the British troops. So we have this series of conflicts that are fought in the 1750s, the French and Indian War. This is very expensive for England and the British. And if you can imagine sending supplies, sending troops all the way to the colonies, all the way to the New World to fight this war, very, very expensive. And at the time that it's resolved, leading up to the 1760s, the British feeling, from Parliament and King George, is that this was largely fought on behalf of the colonies to secure the area that they're living in. And from their perspective back in Britain, they thought the colonies should contribute in terms of the monetary cost, which was significant. So what we'll see is, after the war, a series of different kinds of taxes. And the justification of that from the British perspective was paying for the very costly French and Indian War. Another thing that's upsetting to some of the colonists is something that occurs a few years before the Stamp Act. In fact, and this is the Proclamation of 1763. And in this proclamation, it's like an order, a statement that the colonists are not supposed to go west of a line that's drawn on the map along the Appalachian Mountains. You had some settlers that were desiring to go further west past that point, and they objected to this and times even ignored it. So this is creating further tension. They did not care for that particular proclamation, and we see the heightening of tension between the colonists and the British back in Europe. And this brings us into the Stamp Act, which is set to go into effect in November of 1765. The particular tax when we look at the Stamp Act is this is a tax on printed materials. So things like newspapers, playing cards, court documents, sales receipts for land. With the Stamp Act, these would all require the purchasing of a special stamp, a tax just meant to raise money and in order to purchase these things. So these are pretty common things, especially we look at newspapers, and newspapers would have been one of the main sources of information, right? So of course we're used to having the internet and podcasts and TV and all kinds of different modalities for hearing about what's going on. But for the colonists, newspapers would have been one of the major sources. And then other than that, you largely would have been looking at word of mouth. So newspapers would have been pretty commonly consumed and discussed, and probably pretty popular, much more popular than they probably are today, especially as we look at physical newspapers. So the colonists are really opposed and upset about this. And we'll see that, and we're going to be thinking about that as we look at some primary sources within this assignment, focusing on the Stamp Act docs. So as we look at document A, I'm going to go down to my sourcing information here at the bottom. Sourcing information is always what we want to consider initially. Okay, so first thing we're going to determine, is this a primary or a secondary source? So primary source will be created during the time of the event. And I can see here in my sourcing information that this is created in October 7th, 1765. So this is about 1 month before the tax is going to go into effect. This is a letter, and it appeared in the Boston Gazette newspaper on October 7th, 1765. Okay, so if I think about beyond just being a primary source, what is it? It's a letter to a newspaper. So sometimes people will share their opinion about things that are going on. They'll submit the letter to the newspaper editor, and if the newspaper editor deems it noteworthy or interesting, or whatever the criteria they have, sometimes they'll print that inside the newspaper. So I'm also seeing that this is the Boston Gazette. So I think it's also important not just that it is a newspaper, but also this is a Boston newspaper. So Boston is really going to be this pinpoint spot for the tension that's going on. So we'll look at the colonies breaking away as we think about the American Revolution. But if you were going to point to a spot on the map and say the American Revolution started there, it would without a doubt have to be Boston. We're going to see that we'll have some major events going on within Boston. The Boston Massacre, the Boston Tea Party. We're going to have key leaders organizing in and around Boston with the Sons of Liberty and Paul Revere. And the actual initial fighting is going to start up in close proximity to Boston as we look at the events going on in Lexington and Concord. So Boston really is this point where the feeling of the various colonies and the opposition with British soldiers is really going to come to a boiling point in Boston. So it would have been a really interesting place to be going in the 1760s and into the 1770s as well. Let's read through here document A, a nice primary source. Boston Gazette, October 7, 1765. My dear countrymen, awake, awake, my countrymen, and defeat those who want to enslave us. So look at the verbiage that's being used here. Enslave us. Do not be cowards. You were born in Britain, the land of light, and you were raised in America, the land of liberty. So it's interesting here, he describes Britain as the land of light, which is like showing that he really thinks highly of Britain, right? He's not really putting it down. That he probably still has like a connection to Britain is what we're seeing by that comment. And you were raised in America, the land of liberty. So already we're seeing these American principles coming through and some of the sentiments that are being shared. It is your duty to fight this tax. Future generations will bless your efforts and honor the memory of the saviors of their country. I urge you to tell your representatives that you do not support this terrible and burdensome law. So it's interesting here, this line, I urge you to tell your representatives, because as we've seen and will see, there's a popular slogan from the Revolutionary era, which is no taxation without representation. The colonists did not have a representative in Parliament back in Britain, and Parliament ultimately is the legislative body that's deciding to tax the colonies. So it's interesting here that the letter writer is referencing their representatives. It doesn't really specify who they're referring to. So I'm curious if this is like a local representative as opposed to one in Parliament, but this does seem to be contrary to that slogan, no taxation without representation. Let them know what you think. They should act as guardians of the liberty of their country. I look forward to congratulating you on delivering us from the enemies of truth and liberty. The enemies, look how strong this verbiage is here. The enemies of truth and liberty. So just some notes here on the margin. This is a strong tone. It's urging action. Talks about future generations. Now, future generations will bless your efforts and honor the memory of the saviors of their country. This is really showing a high level of importance. So based on what we're seeing here in document A, it seems like the colonists are upset because they feel like their rights are being violated. All right, let's get a comparison here and look at document B. And again, the first thing we want to look at is our sourcing information. So this letter was written in a London newspaper, so back in Britain, and then published in the Boston Gazette. So it's reprinted in the Boston Gazette, but it's originating from that London newspaper. And supplement 2 months after the Stamp Act went into effect. So this is after the 2 months, so this would be right around January. The Stamp Act went into effect. In November of 1765, so 2 months after that would be roughly January 1766. All right, so this is coming from London. This is coming from Britain. So that's I would expect to see something that they think that the tax is reasonable, that the colonists should contribute, just like any other Englishman would be expected to do. And I'm expecting something that's critical of the action of the colonists and their protests and their outcries of injustice regarding the Stamp Act. But let's see. Boston Gazette supplement, 27 January 1766. So, and again, although it says Boston Gazette, this is reprinted from the London newspaper, from a late London paper. The riotous behavior of the people in Boston is remarkable. I would have been less surprised by their behavior if they had taxed their beer, because everyone drinks beer, but the Stamp Act is a tax on none of the necessities of life. It does not affect the poor, and even a poor person can afford this little amount of money. The tax on newspapers only affects the rich. Common people do not purchase newspapers. Isn't it surprising then that the mob in Boston has begun to riot against this tax even before it has officially gone into effect? All right, strong verbiage against the colonists here. So we see kind of different perspectives here, which is nice. Whenever we're looking at primary sources, ideally we'd get a variety of different perspectives. But this also has a strong tone, and it's really questioning the actions and criticizing the actions of the colonists. So let's take a look at some of this verbiage here that indicates this strong tone, describing their behavior as riotous. This would suggest that they're being violent, that they're taking things too far, that they're behaving like a mob, and saying it's remarkable, that this is indicating that it's like shocking how they're conducting themselves. I would have been less surprised by their behavior if they had taxed their beer. Okay, because everyone drinks beer. All right, and keep in mind, this was the statement like everybody drinks beer. Sometimes they had a hard time getting clean drinking water, so they tended to gravitate towards these kinds of drinks. It's not necessarily to mean like they're just constantly getting drunk, although, you know, sometimes I'm sure they were, but this reference is not necessarily indicating that. But the Stamp Act is a tax of none of the necessities of life, right? So the London paper here is pointing out, right, you don't need these things. So you could simply choose to not buy them, which is interesting because that's actually one of the methods in which the colonists actually fight this tax, is that they deliberately choose not to buy the things that are being taxed. They organize boycotts. So boycott is when, due to being upset about something, you choose not to purchase that particular good or from that company or organization or whatever the case may be. But in this case, the colonists will organize boycotts about these things. So they actually use that to their advantage, that they don't necessarily need them. And even a poor person can afford this little amount of money. Newspapers only affects the rich. Common people do not purchase newspapers. So it's surprising then, describing them as a mob in Boston. Again, this major area. Boston's really critical. And again, describing them as being rioting. And even before it's gone into effect, right? So they haven't even experienced it yet. So interesting here too, because the Boston newspaper is choosing to print this, and this is probably going to upset people in Boston when they read this. Reprinting things like this is going to also contribute to some of this feeling of resentment that's going on because this is something that people would have been probably running in and showing their friends in the local gathering areas and things of that nature. So we get a different perspective, but still very strong tone, just as before, but suggesting that this is a reasonable thing. As we look at document C here, we have our source information at the bottom. The letter above was written by John Hughes, stamp distributor in Philadelphia, to his bosses in London. His job was to collect the tax on stamps. All right, so interesting. So he is a tax collector. He is the one who's enforcing this law. He's in Philadelphia, and he's writing a letter to his bosses. So one of the things that we want to do is we look at multiple primary source documents, which all three of these documents are, right? They're all created during the time of the causes of the American Revolution, during the era of the Stamp Act, late 1765, early 1766. And this is interesting because we want to see, do they corroborate one another, right? Do they agree? Do they disagree? Do they show contrary things? And sometimes if we have multiple different sources, we can try to piece them together to gain a better understanding of a particular historical event or era. So things that we might conclude or might look for, why were the colonists upset about the Stamp Act? And compare that for document A, B, and C. Was the Stamp Act an unreasonable and unfair tax? Right, so document A suggests it was, document B suggests that it wasn't. So they say, hey, this is no big deal, this only affects the rich. Were the colonists treated like slaves, right? So the document A references them being enslaved and really uses a high, strong tone of language. Were the British violating the colonists' rights? How were the colonists behaving in response to the Stamp Act? So what were they actually doing? I suspect, looking at the sourcing information, that document C will give us more insight on that. Documents A and B highlight how they felt about it, but what were they actually doing, right? So John Hughes is probably witnessing that because he's a tax collector and he's writing back to his bosses back in London. So eager to see if document C gives us some insight in terms of what the colonists were actually doing in response. All right, let's take a look here. Philadelphia, January 13th, 1766. Okay, so this is a letter from John Hughes. He's a stamp distributor in Philadelphia. This is collecting the tax. He's writing to his bosses in London. My lords, the colonists have been insulting His Majesty, the King, saying that the Stamp Act was unconstitutional and oppressive. Oppressive is like abusing someone's rights. Abuse of rights. It is apparent to many people here that the Presbyterians are at the head of these riots. Presbyterians, a religion that gained popularity during the Great Awakening. They are opposed to kings, and some cry out, no kings but King Jesus. The leaders fill every newspaper with inflammatory pieces so that the minds of the common people are kept in a continual ferment. No one dares write anything that would calm the people down. Doing so would put the writer's life and fortune in danger. Really highlighting that fervor that's going on and how upset the colonists are. Inflammatory, arising, angry, or violent feelings. I am convinced the Presbyterians intend nothing less than the throwing off their allegiance and obedience to His Majesty and forming a republican empire in America and being lords and masters themselves. I am daily threatened by verbal messages and anonymous letters with a mob of several thousand people from the Jerseys, New York, and New England. I conclude with praying that the Almighty may secure the allegiance of America to the crown of Britain by destroying the seeds of rebellion and by punishing the ringleaders of these riots. I am, my lords, your most obedient and most humble servant, John Hughes. So having read through document C, getting a first-hand account and description of what's actually happening, the first two are kind of opinion pieces here. We're going to focus on document C when we answer these questions. So our sourcing information for document C, contextualization based on his account, what's going on in America in 1766, how has the Stamp Act affected him personally? Make sure you're providing evidence. Do you believe his account? Do you think it's trustworthy? Is it believable? Or do you question its accuracy, and why? This is important. Do you think he has bias? Why or why not? And you should be able to make a compelling reason why. Corroboration. How does the account in this document compare to the account in Stamp Act documents A and B? So corroboration, compare and contrast A and B with document C. Do you think most colonists were upset about the Stamp Act? Or do you think a few leaders riled up everyone? Good question. All right, so make sure you're answering these questions thoroughly. Can't wait to see your answers. Bye for now.